open markets in terms of trade, those are the ones that grow faster over time. It's no great mystery. One of the things I like doing when I try to convince policymakers in the US about these issues is I'll take two countries that 40 years ago had very similar standards of living. One of my favorite examples is Singapore and Jamaica. You go back to the early 1960s and they both had the same average per capita income. Now Singapore is one of the richest economies in the world, and Jamaica has hardly increased at all in terms of their living standards. They've grown slower than the world average, and of course the world average growth has been way below what we've seen in Singapore. Why is that? Well, Singapore has managed to have, for decade after decade, 5 to 6% growth, whereas places like Jamaica stumble along with 1% or, if they're lucky, 2% growth. What worries me about Europe is that there's sort of a new normal. Instead of in an advanced, mature economy, okay, in an advanced, mature economy, 3 to 4% is good growth, not 6 to 7%. But we're now in a situation where a lot of countries, they're almost celebrating if they get 1 or 2% growth. And remember, the difference in how fast living standards rise, depending on what your growth rates are, makes an enormous difference. The average person might begin to feel that there's no real benefit to them from economic growth if they can't sense, even over 5 or 10 years, why they're better off with an economy growing. Not to mention the complication that if you have politicians doing government interventions like we did in the US with bad monetary policy and bad housing policy with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that leads to a recession, and people blame that recession on free markets when it was caused by government. So you have the combination of relatively anemic growth with a completely misguided narrative of what caused the Great Recession. That's a very dangerous combination in terms of whether or not people are going to appreciate what's necessary to get more growth in the future. Now, my one hope, and we're each told only speak for about 8 minutes, so I'm going to be very abbreviated. My one hope is that we have bad role models in the world. I like the fact that they're good role models. I'm always talking about, the economic reforms that we see in some Eastern European countries, the long-term good policy we see in Singapore and Hong Kong and places like that. But the bad role models also teach us something. And that's maybe even more relevant because sometimes I think politicians can identify with the bad role models. You look at countries that get the very low scores on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and whether you're talking about the really extreme examples, the Cubas, the North Koreas, the Venezuelas of the world, who obviously have just decade upon decade of economic stagnation and misery, or whether you're simply talking about sort of the conventional European type welfare state, you compare those countries and you compare the 1 to 2% growth they have to countries that are otherwise very similar in terms of demographics that manage to get 3 to 4% growth, and you look at the divergence in living standards over time, that should tell us a very important lesson. In other words, I'll close on this very simple point. The world is a laboratory. We have all these experiments, 200 experiments. Now maybe only 100 of them are big enough to even care about and notice. But those experiments, I think, do a very good job of teaching us that as you go farther and farther down the path to a big welfare state that discourages labor supply, remember that's one of the factors of production, to a punitive tax system that punishes people who save and invest, and what's the other factor of production? Capital. Matter of fact, I'll close on one point about taxing capital that I can't resist because I think it's so powerful. Let's say you own an apple orchard. What's the smart way to harvest those apples? If you believe in the class warfare left-wing view that you should not only tax income but also tax capital, you would harvest those apples by either chopping down the tree or sawing off the branches of the tree. Now think about whether that makes sense in the long run. If you actually want not only to have income this year, but income next year and the year after that, the much better way is to pick the apples from the tree, not to saw off the branches. And what worries me about a lot of the class warfare, hate the rich mentality that we're seeing in some European countries, we also see it to some degree in the United States, it completely overlooks the importance of good policy, not just tax policy, but good policy across the board if we want to have capital increasing and used efficiently, and if we want labor to be increased and used efficiently. Thank you very much.
Dr. Victoria Bateman, who is an expert in the accretion of the relevance of economic history to policy making today.
Now, just as we should be reveling in the joys of economic recovery, and some 7 rather long and lean years on from the financial crisis, a gloom has descended across the economics profession, and that gloom comes from the threat of secular stagnation. The spectre that haunts us is worrying on 2 levels. The first concerns a slowdown in the economy's growth potential. According to Gordon, even if technological progress continues at past levels, 4 headwinds will eat away at the growth of the West. Unfavourable demographics, a limit to the extent to which higher education can be further expanded, rising inequality, and high levels of public debt. When combined, Gordon suggests that these factors alone could knock 1.2% per annum off the American growth rate. Now, in addition to slower growth potential, other economists argue that we're also suffering from demand deficiency, from interest rates being unable to reach low enough levels to ensure that there's enough demand in the economy to mop up what growth potential does exist. Larry Summers has suggested that the response to this should be greater fiscal policy. However, the obvious risk there is that we only serve to reignite old problems: government spending sprees, consumer booms, and property booms. For the time being, the future looks bleak. Our economy seems to be taking a knock from both sides, the demand and the supply side here in the West. Now, this evening, I want to propose a new solution, one that can tackle the problem of secular stagnation in the West and can also tackle the other big giant, inequality. It's a solution that's based on a new way of looking at the problems we're currently facing. And that new way of looking at the current problems is that the global economy is facing a severe sex problem. Now, as we'll see, history suggests a clear way forward, and that way forward is empowering women across the globe. Now, mention sex, and any good economist should bring Malthus to mind. As a bunch, economists are historically famous for their dismal science, and Malthus was one of the original doomsters. He was an eternal pessimist, and despite being a religious man, he thought that helping the poor through redistribution and benefits would be futile. His reasoning was that the passion between the sexes meant that population would overpower resources in the economy, keeping the standard of living trapped at a low level. So if we go back to those original doomsters, sex and secular stagnation are very much intertwined. Now, whilst Malthus's model of the economy has largely been discredited by modern-day economists, his thinking about population is highly relevant to the modern day. As the financier Toby Nangle has recently argued, one of the key developments in the past 35 years has been a big expansion in the effective labour supply facing businesses here in the West. And that big expansion has come from globalisation, from the ability to offshore and through greater migration of workers across the globe. Now, Toby Nangle argues that the result has been decreased bargaining power for workers here in the West, contributing to rising inequality, and a shift away from using capital towards using more labour-intensive production processes, resulting in lower investment, those low real interest rates that central bankers are concerned about, and with the lower investment, slower productivity growth. Now, whilst today's world might look troubling on this count, history shows just how bad things can really become. Throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and as the economic historian Bob Allen has showed, wages were on a persistent downward trend across most of Europe. So that's for 300 years. At the same time, much of Europe was stagnating. However, all was not bleak. As Bob Allen also shows, there was an exception to the rule, and that exception was here in Northwest Europe. In Britain and the Netherlands, wages began to resist the downward trend, and economic expansion took hold. Now, according to economic historians' most recent work, the empowerment of women in northwestern Europe was the central driving force behind that. From early on, women They went out to work, and as a result they delayed marriage and so reproductive activity until they were in their mid-20s. That helped to keep families smaller, and that helped to keep wages higher, which, according to Bob Allen, provided firms with an incentive to mechanise, increasing investment and the pace of technological change, resulting in the Industrial Revolution. And for almost 2 centuries, the West then entered a virtuous circle in which high wages and investment and productivity growth positively fed back on each other. Now, going back to more recent times, that expansion in labour supply throughout the globe has begun to undermine that virtuous circle, placing downward pressure on wages in the West. Now, the obvious solution, when you think about it, would be to resist globalisation, to put up barriers and to limit immigration, as we know many political parties are pushing for. However, if we wish to maintain the benefits of greater global integration, we need to look for another solution. And that solution, to my mind, is empowering women in poorer countries. Now, here we've got to begin with the fact that's perhaps obvious to any woman, that if women have agency, if they have control over their bodies, they will at the ground level make fertility choices that affect their own families, that benefit their own family standard of living, and through that benefit workers across the globe. Now, for a woman to have control over her body, for her to have control over her fertility, economic empowerment is vital. Opportunities to become educated and opportunities to work. Rather than being a pawn to be married off at a young age, destined to produce child after child in a lifetime of poverty, women who have an ability to support themselves financially can take control of their lives. They have the financial freedom that allows them to stand up to early marriage, to go out into the world to build an independent life, determining for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. With that economic dependence, a woman's womb becomes her own. So if you want to help the global economy, there's no better way of doing it than giving women the freedom that they need to have the choice over their baby-making capacity. If we can empower women, we can harness the invisible hand. By acting in their own self-interest, women will be able to aid the wider global economy. Now, the room for improvement here is significant. In comparison with Britain, where we remember women were getting married in their mid-20s in the years before the Industrial Revolution, according to UNICEF, in countries like Bangladesh, Niger, Mali, Chad, Central African Republic, at least 6 out of 10 women aged 20 to 49 were child brides. Now, an important exception to this is China. Back in 1980, China was home to more people than anywhere else in the world. However, since 1981, almost 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty in that country alone. Now, according to Arthur Brooks, globalization and market liberalization are largely responsible for this. However, I'd suggest another equally as important part of the story, and that's the changing position of women in China. By taking steps to restrain population through its one-child policy, the Chinese state has managed to overcome a population problem that has blighted the standard of living of the poor throughout the centuries. Along the way, it's freed women to work outside of the home, providing them with a degree of economic independence, and challenged the traditional gender role of women being in the home. Now, while such a policy might have helped lift many people out of poverty in China, it has, of course, come at a big price, reducing liberty and freedom of families, and along the way, bringing the phenomenon of missing women. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that other developing economies should follow in the footsteps of China, but perhaps instead they can look to the history of countries such as Britain and pursue an agenda of female empowerment through education and work opportunities. Now, compared with China, India still has something to learn, and that's, of course, the other big population centre in the world. Following the high-profile number of cases of violence against women gender inequality is a big problem. According to the national census, 23 million young women were married off whilst they were children. The average age of women who are 25 to 49, the average age at which they were married in India, 17.4, and in poorer groups it's closer to 15. Again, compare that with where we were in Britain the centuries before our economic takeoff, where it was 25 to 26 years old. So if we can improve the position of women and girls in poorer countries, many of the problems here in richer economies will naturally resolve themselves. Global population growth will be more in line with our economy's potential, improving the bargaining position of workers here in the West and lowering inequality with it. At the same time, those what will be more expensive workers will encourage businesses to invest more in machinery and capital, helping us to remove ourselves from that low interest rate trap, creating more demand in the economy and raising productivity growth. Women are the missing element in all of the current macroeconomic discussions, something which might reflect a lack of women in the economics discipline itself. I could perhaps note that one of the most popular books on the issue of secular stagnation, published by a colleague of mine, Professor Kuhn Toynings and Richard Baldwin, a few months ago, back in August 2014, had 21 contributors, not a single one was female. It's perhaps therefore little wonder that economists have overlooked the role of women in creating greater global growth and an exit from secular stagnation. It's time now to bring women in from the cold if we really want to sort out the big problems we face, and not only that of secular stagnation but inequality. It's time for a sexual revolution in the economics profession and in the global economy.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, welcome from me. I'm delighted to have so many people here. The IOB has 35,000 members and around 3,000 student members. And to me, the most important message we can possibly get across is that the most interesting, the most fulfilling thing that young people can do these days is to set up their own business. And that's a message I hope we're going to keep promoting. And it's very difficult to be entrepreneurial if you are a young person, as applies through so much of Europe, when demographic unemployment levels are twice the EU average. The EU average for unemployment amongst 19 to 24-year-olds is 23.5%, but in countries like Greece, 58%, Spain, 55%, Croatia, 50%. It is stifling entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurial opportunity. It's very difficult to be entrepreneurial when you have to delay consumption to save and invest. Because an idea that you want to bring to market has very limited possibilities, there are very limited employment opportunities, and you are heavily indebted. It's very difficult to be entrepreneurial if you want to start a business, but you have to pay wages, as you do through so much of Europe, determined by unions that represent a tiny proportion of the population, but whose decisions affect countries and sectors, increasing barriers to entry in order to regulate and stymie their competition. And the unions in these cases represent the older and the bigger firms, not the young, the small, startups, all of whom have to abide by laws derived from labour agreements or break the law and operate in a shadow economy where wages are more reflective of market rates, but where taxes aren't collected and where there's no recourse if there are contractual issues. Entrepreneurs, in other words, have to choose between the contractual uncertainty of the shadow economy or the former labour market where the odds are stacked against them. And to me, these are the fundamental problems of so much of the lack of entrepreneurship throughout Europe. Excessive tax, excessive regulation, and a sclerotic labour market which does not allow the opportunities that we do have to a considerable extent in this country. And that's why I share Fraser's concern that these battles need to be fought over and over again, and that in particular they need to be fought in this country at the moment. It's difficult to be entrepreneurial when the fundamentals that underpin an economy are warped to privilege the few to the detriment of the many. And Europe, in my view, needs to have a difficult conversation with itself about the kind of life it wants the people of Europe to lead. If it continues shielding the old, the privileged, the unionized, and the lucky, then it is going to have to accommodate lost generations. Catastrophic youth unemployment will become the new norm. There will be times of boom and employment growth in the future, much like Spain's average 10% GDP before the crisis, but it will be brittle growth, dependent on temporary employment rather than secure employment. Not an argument to abolish 0 hours contracts as in this country, but rather to make them less attractive relative to permanent employment. The UK is the leader in Europe on all this. We have a flexible labour market where those who operate the temporary employment are able to attain that and use it to suit their needs. The same goes for firms. Firm-level productivity decisions are best made at the firm level, and that to me is key to entrepreneurialism. People know what is best for themselves, and that is reflected in the levels of immigration to this country. The free market needs to be fought for consistently and vigorously. The reality that government can't solve everything and that giveaways of the kind that are being offered at all